There is a secret in this story that most people won't see coming, and when it finally comes out, everything changes. Nobody wanted to help the old woman who fed pigeons on the courthouse steps. Her own children had stopped visiting. Her neighbors thought she was losing her mind. But when a homeless 16-year-old boy sat down beside her one afternoon and shared his last piece of bread, she did something nobody expected. She rewrote her entire will. And what that boy read out loud at her funeral brought 300 people to silence and her own family to shame. Good to have you here, friends. Please like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Tell us where you're joining from in the comments. Atlanta? London? Maybe Ghana or Barbados? We're curious. Now listen, I'm going to tell you something that's going to make your blood boil. But it's also going to make you believe in people again. Because this story has both kinds. The kind that make you sick, and the kind that make you cry. And it starts with a boy named Josiah. Josiah Marcus Benton was 16 years old. He was thin, not the lean, athletic kind of thin that teenage boys brag about, but the hungry kind. The kind of thin that comes from not knowing where your next meal is coming from, and your body deciding to burn itself for fuel. He had dark brown skin that was ashy in the winter because lotion was a luxury, and his hands were rough and cracked at the knuckles from sleeping outdoors when the shelters were full. He had large, serious eyes, the color of black coffee, set in a face that was too old for his age. Not old in years, old in experience. Old in the way that children get old when the world stops being kind to them before they're ready. Josiah had been homeless, on and off, since he was 13. His mother, Denise Benton, had struggled with addiction, pills at first, then worse. She loved Josiah. Let me say that clearly. She loved that boy with everything she had. But addiction is a thief that steals everything. And it stole Denise piece by piece until there was nothing left to hold a life together. She lost the apartment when Josiah was 12. They stayed in shelters for a year. Those long, gray buildings with the metal beds and the fluorescent lights that buzzed all night and the smell of bleach and other people's laundry. Then Denise disappeared for 3 weeks. She came back thinner, shaking, apologizing. She disappeared again, came back again. Then one morning, when Josiah was 13, she didn't come back at all. He waited, the way children wait, stubbornly, faithfully, long past the point when an adult would have stopped. He waited at the shelter for 2 weeks. Then the shelter moved him to a group home in East Baltimore, a narrow brick house with 6 other boys and a house mother named Mrs. Proctor, who meant well but was overwhelmed and underpaid. Josiah stayed for 5 months. Then he ran. Not because anyone was cruel to him. He ran because the group home felt like a cage. And Josiah had decided, the way only a 13-year-old can decide, with the absolute certainty of someone who has nothing left to lose, that he would rather be free and hungry than safe and trapped. For 3 years, Josiah lived on the streets of Baltimore. He slept in doorways, under bridges, in the back pews of churches that left their doors unlocked. He ate at soup kitchens. He washed his face in gas station bathrooms. He read books. That was his one constant, the one thread that connected the boy he was to the boy he might have been. He read anything he could find. Paperbacks left on park benches, newspapers from trash cans, magazines in library lobbies. The Baltimore Public Library on Cathedral Street became his living room. He went there every day it was open, sat in the back corner of the second floor near the history section, and read until closing time. The librarians knew him. A woman named Ms. Watkins, who had gray hair and cat-eye glasses and a voice like warm tea, started saving books for him behind the desk. Novels, biographies, poetry collections. She never asked him where he lived. She never called anyone. She just put the books in a paper bag and said, "These are for you, Josiah." Josiah had a habit, one specific habit that defined him. Every morning, no matter where he slept, no matter how cold or hungry he was, he found something to eat, and he broke it in half. He ate one half and saved the other. Always. Even when he was starving. Even when his stomach was so empty it hurt like a fist pressing inward. He saved half because his mother had taught him that. Always save something for someone who needs it more, Denise had told him when he was 7 or 8, sitting on the floor of their old apartment, sharing a sleeve of crackers. There's always somebody who needs it more. Can you believe that? A boy with nothing, saving half of nothing for somebody else. That's the kind of person Josiah was. And that habit, that simple, stubborn habit, is what changed his entire life. But what happened next changed everything. On a Tuesday afternoon in September, Josiah was sitting on the steps of the Waverly Courthouse in North Baltimore. He had half a piece of bread in his hand, wheat bread, the end piece that nobody else wanted, from the bag the soup kitchen had given him that morning. He was eating the other half slowly, making it last, the way hungry people do. The sun was warm, but the breeze was cool, and the courthouse steps were gray granite that held the heat like a blanket. An old woman sat down beside him. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hover or hesitate. She just sat down on the step next to him with a soft grunt and a sigh, like she had been walking a long time and her body was grateful to stop. She was small, maybe 5'2", and she was old, but not frail. Her back was straight. Her chin was up. She had white hair, thin and soft, cut short around her face, and pale blue eyes that were sharp and clear and missed nothing. She wore a long gray coat over a simple dress, flat shoes, no jewelry except a thin gold wedding band on her left hand. She carried a brown paper bag in her lap. She looked like somebody's grandmother. She also looked like somebody who was used to being in charge. She opened the paper bag and pulled out a handful of breadcrumbs. She tossed them on the sidewalk. Within seconds, pigeons appeared, 5, 10, 20, cooing and bobbing their heads, their feet clicking on the concrete like tiny typewriters. The old woman watched them eat with a concentration that made it seem like this was the most important task in the world. Josiah watched her for a minute. Then he said, "You come here a lot?" The old woman glanced at him. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, rain or shine. These birds are the most reliable friends I have." Josiah almost smiled. "My mama used to say pigeons are just doves that got tired of dressing up." The old woman looked at him, really looked at him, not through him, not past him, not around him, the way most people looked at homeless teenagers, as if eye contact might be contagious. She looked at him the way a person looks at a book whose cover they don't recognize, but whose first line has hooked them. "Your mama sounds like a wise woman," she said. "She was," Josiah said, and the past tense hung in the air between them like smoke. The old woman didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer sympathy or advice or the kind of empty words that people give to suffering they don't understand. She just nodded once, slowly, and went back to feeding the pigeons. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Josiah looked at the half piece of bread in his hand. He looked at the old woman. He looked at the pigeons, and without saying a word, he broke his remaining half in two, leaned forward, and set a piece on the step near her paper bag. "In case your birds are still hungry," he said. The old woman looked at the bread. She looked at Josiah, and something shifted in her face. Not pity, not surprise, but recognition. The way you look at someone and realize suddenly that they are made of the same material as you. "What's your name?" she asked. "Josiah." "Josiah, my name is Margaret. Margaret Holloway. And I think you and I are going to be friends." Now here is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Because Margaret Holloway was not just an old woman who fed pigeons. Margaret Clarissa Holloway was 81 years old, and she was worth $1.4 billion. She was the founder and former CEO of Holloway Medical Systems, one of the largest medical device companies on the East Coast. She'd built it from nothing. A single patent for a surgical clamp she designed in her garage in 1972 when she was 29 years old, and women in engineering were about as welcome as pigeons at a wedding. She fought her way into a man's industry with a brain like a blade and a backbone like a steel beam. By 50, she was running a company with 2,000 employees. By 60, she was on the cover of Fortune. By 70, she had sold the company for $1.2 billion, kept a 40% stake in the successor firm, and retired to a brownstone in Roland Park, where she lived alone with a cat named Bertrand and a house full of books. She had been married once, to a man named Thomas Holloway, an engineer she met at Johns Hopkins in 1966. Thomas was kind and quiet and brilliant, and he adored Margaret with the steady, unshakable devotion of a man who understood that his wife was extraordinary and never once felt threatened by it. Thomas died in 2009, a heart attack in his sleep, and Margaret woke up beside him in the morning and knew before she touched his hand that he was gone. She buried him in Druid Ridge Cemetery under an oak tree and visited every Sunday with a book, because Thomas had always said his favorite thing in the world was listening to Margaret read. Now, here is what makes this story so painful. Margaret had 3 children, and not one of them deserved her. The oldest was Richard Holloway, 56. Richard was a real estate investor in Bethesda, Maryland, with a large house, a second wife, and a taste for expensive wine that he bought more for the label than the flavor. Richard called his mother on her birthday and at Christmas. Sometimes he forgot the birthday. He never forgot Christmas, because Christmas meant gifts, and Richard's second wife, Vanessa, had expectations about gifts. The middle child was Laura Holloway Price, 53. Laura lived in Potomac with her husband, an orthodontist named Craig, who was aggressively boring and proud of it. Laura was involved in charity work, the kind where you put on a gown and attend a dinner and write a check and call it service. She visited Margaret once a year, always in the spring, always for exactly one night, and she always managed to say something that made Margaret feel like a burden. "Mother, this house is too big for you. Mother, you really should consider assisted living. Mother, have you updated your will? Have you updated your will?" That question. Can you believe that? A daughter visiting her 81-year-old mother, and the thing she wants to discuss is the will. Not, how are you feeling? Not, are you lonely? Not, can I sit on the porch with you and tell you I love you? The will. The money. The thing they were all waiting for. The youngest was David Holloway, 49. David was the one Margaret had been closest to. Once. As a boy, David was sensitive and curious and followed Margaret around the house asking questions about how things worked. He wanted to be an engineer like his parents, but somewhere in his 20s, David lost his way. He started a tech company that failed, then another one, then a third. He borrowed money from Margaret, $200,000 the first time, $300,000 the second, $500,000 the third. Each time, he promised to pay it back. He never did. He never even tried. The failures hardened him. The debt embarrassed him. And instead of facing his mother and his shame, David stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped returning messages. The last time Margaret heard from David was a text message on Thanksgiving 2 years ago. It said, "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom." 5 words. No phone call, no visit. 5 words, and then silence. 3 children, and Margaret Holloway, 81 years old, worth $1.4 billion, sat on a courthouse step feeding pigeons with a 16-year-old homeless boy because he was the only person in her life who had given her something without wanting anything in return. And that was only the beginning. Over the next year, Josiah and Margaret met on the courthouse steps every Tuesday and Thursday. It became a rhythm, as steady and reliable as the pigeons themselves. Margaret brought breadcrumbs for the birds and a sandwich for Josiah, wrapped in wax paper, always the same, roast beef with mustard and lettuce on rye. Josiah brought whatever book he was reading from the library, and sometimes he'd read passages out loud to Margaret while the pigeons milled around their feet. Margaret loved that. She'd close her eyes and listen the way she used to listen to Thomas, and sometimes she'd nod and say, "Read that part again," and Josiah would read it again, and the pigeons would coo like they were listening too. Margaret never told Josiah she was rich. She dressed simply. She took the bus to the courthouse, even though she had a car and a driver. She carried her breadcrumbs in a plain brown bag. She spoke the way she'd always spoken, direct, clear, without pretension. Josiah assumed she was a retired schoolteacher maybe, or a librarian. He didn't ask. He didn't care. She was Margaret. She showed up. She brought sandwiches. She listened when he talked about his mother, about the library, about the books he was reading. She never tried to fix him or save him or turn him into a project. She just sat beside him and shared the steps and the bread and the silence and the sound of pigeons eating. But Margaret was watching. She was always watching. She noticed things. She noticed that Josiah always broke his food in half. She noticed that he said please and thank you and ma'am with the automatic ease of a boy who had been raised right, even if the raising had been cut short. She noticed that he read books the way some people breathe, constantly, deeply, like his survival depended on it. She noticed that when it rained, Josiah would move under the courthouse overhang but never leave. He'd stay on those steps and wait for her even when the sky was pouring, because he had said he would be there. And Josiah Benton did not break his word. One afternoon in November, about 3 months after they met, Margaret said, "Josiah, where do you sleep?" Josiah was quiet for a moment. He looked at the pigeons. He said, "Different places." "Like where?" "Sometimes the shelter on Greenmount. Sometimes the library lobby if they forget to lock the side door. Sometimes the park." Margaret nodded. She didn't react with shock or horror or the performative concern that some people wear like a costume. She just nodded. Then she said, "I have a spare room in my house. It has a bed and a desk and a bookshelf. It's yours if you want it." Josiah looked at her. His large, serious eyes searched her face for something. A catch, a condition, a trick. He had learned in 3 years on the streets that free things are never free, that kindness usually comes with a price, that adults who offer rooms to teenage boys usually want something. Margaret saw what he was thinking. She said, "Josiah, I am 81 years old. I live alone with a cat who ignores me. I have a spare room that no one uses. I am not offering you charity. I am offering you a place to read your books without the wind blowing the pages. That is all." Josiah thought about it for 3 days. He went back to the courthouse on Thursday and said, "Can I meet the cat first?" Margaret smiled. Actually smiled. Not the polite, public smile she had perfected over 50 years of business, but a real one, wide and bright, the kind that rearranges a person's whole face. "His name is Bertrand," she said, "and he will pretend to hate you. But he pretends to hate everyone. Don't take it personally." Josiah moved into Margaret's spare room on a Saturday afternoon in November. He carried everything he owned in a backpack: 2 t-shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a toothbrush, and 4 library books. Margaret had made the room ready. Clean sheets, a reading lamp on the desk, a bookshelf, empty, waiting to be filled. And on the nightstand, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Roast beef with mustard and lettuce on rye. Josiah sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the room. He looked at the bookshelf. He picked up the sandwich. And for the first time in 3 years, he didn't break it in half. He ate the whole thing, because for the first time in 3 years, he was in a place where he didn't need to save anything for later. Later was here. Later was now. Later was a room with a lamp and a bookshelf and a cat named Bertrand who walked in, looked at Josiah with supreme indifference, and jumped onto the bed and fell asleep like Josiah had always been there. But what happened in that house over the next months was something nobody, not Josiah, not Margaret, not the pigeons, could have predicted. Margaret enrolled Josiah in school, not a public school, a private academy called Waverly Preparatory, where the tuition was $28,000 a year, and the students wore blazers and ties and carried leather book bags that cost more than anything Josiah had ever owned. Margaret paid for everything: tuition, uniform, books, a new backpack. She hired a tutor named Mr. Kim, a patient Korean man with wire-rimmed glasses, to help Josiah catch up on the 3 years of education he had missed. Josiah was terrified. He stood in front of the school on his first day in his new blazer, navy blue, brass buttons, stiff as cardboard, and looked at the brick building and the manicured lawn and the boys getting out of BMWs and Range Rovers, and he thought, "I do not belong here. This place is not for people like me." Margaret, who had driven him in her old Volvo, rolled down the window and said, "Josiah, do you know what the difference is between you and those boys?" "About $3 million, Josiah said. Margaret laughed. A real laugh, loud and sharp, that startled the birds in the tree above the car. "The difference," she said, "is that those boys have had everything handed to them. You have had to build everything yourself. Which means when it gets hard, and it will get hard, they will fold. And you won't. Because you already know what hard is. Now go in there and show them what you're made of. Josiah went. He walked through the front doors of Waverly Prep with his backpack and his library-trained vocabulary, and the quiet, steady confidence of a boy who had survived things that would break most grown men. He didn't fold. He didn't even bend. Within 6 months, his grades were in the top 10% of his class. Within a year, he was first in English, second in history, and the editor of the school literary magazine. Mr. Kim told Margaret that Josiah was the most naturally gifted student he had ever tutored. "He reads like he's starving," Mr. Kim said. "Because he was," Margaret replied. At home, and it was home now, that brownstone in Roland Park with the creaky stairs and the dusty bookshelves and the cat who slept on Josiah's feet at night, Josiah and Margaret fell into a routine. Josiah came home from school at 3:30. He did homework at the kitchen table while Margaret read in her armchair by the window. At 5 o'clock, they made dinner together. Margaret taught him how to cook the way she taught everything, by doing, not explaining. Chop the onion. Smaller. Smaller. Good. Stir the soup. Not that fast. You're stirring, not punishing it. Taste it. More salt? Good. You're learning. They ate at the kitchen table. They talked. Margaret told Josiah about Thomas, about the company, about the surgical clamp she invented in her garage when she was 29, and nobody believed a woman could design surgical instruments. Josiah told Margaret about his mother, about the shelters, about the library and Ms. Watkins who saved him books in paper bags. They talked about books. Margaret loved Toni Morrison, Josiah loved James Baldwin, and they argued about which one was greater with the passionate intensity of two people who care deeply about words. After dinner, Josiah washed the dishes, always, without being asked. He dried them and put them away in the right cabinets, because he had memorized where everything went by the second week. Then he sat in the living room and read while Margaret sat across from him and read, and Bertrand slept between them like a furry comma connecting two separate sentences. It was the quietest, simplest, most beautiful life either of them had ever known. And it lasted for 2 years. And just when Josiah thought things couldn't get any better, they got worse. Margaret was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in May of Josiah's senior year. She had been tired for weeks. Not the normal tired of an 83-year-old woman, but a deep, dense, bone-level exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. She stopped coming to the courthouse steps in April. She told Josiah it was her knees, but Josiah noticed other things. She wasn't eating. She was losing weight. Her skin had taken on a yellowish tint that looked wrong in the morning light. He didn't say anything because he had learned from years of watching his mother that you don't force people to name their pain before they're ready. You just stay close and wait. The doctors confirmed it in May. Stage 4. The tumor was in the head of the pancreas and had already spread to the liver. The oncologist, a tall woman with kind eyes and the careful voice of someone who delivers bad news every day, explained the options. There weren't many. Chemotherapy might buy a few months. Surgery was not an option. Clinical trials were a possibility, but Margaret said no. She said she had spent 50 years making calculated bets in business, and she knew a losing hand when she saw one. She told Josiah on a Tuesday, their day, the pigeon day, sitting on the back porch instead of the courthouse steps because her body was too tired for the bus now. The porch smelled like the neighbor's jasmine bush and the old wood of the railing and the faint, clean scent of the rain that had fallen that morning and was still drying on the brick steps. "Josiah, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm sick. The kind of sick that doesn't get better. The kind where the doctors give you a number instead of a plan." Josiah didn't speak. His large, serious eyes filled with water, but he did not blink. He did not look away. He sat very still, the way he sat when something important was happening, the way he sat in the library, the way he sat on the courthouse steps, completely present, completely absorbed, giving all of himself to the moment because that was the only thing he knew how to give. "How long?" he asked. His voice was steady. Steady the way a bridge is steady. Because it has to be. Because something depends on it. "The doctors say 6 months, maybe less, maybe a little more. They don't know. Doctors are just people with better guesses and worse news. Josiah nodded. He looked at the backyard, at the garden Margaret never tended because she said plants required more optimism than she had, at the fence with the peeling paint that he kept meaning to fix, at the sky going orange and pink at the edges like the day was blushing before it left. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I know you're not. You never have. What do you need?" Margaret looked at this boy, this 18-year-old boy who had once slept under bridges and eaten half pieces of bread and carried everything he owned in a backpack that weighed less than Bertrand. And she saw what she had always seen. Not a project, not a charity case, not a substitute for the children who had abandoned her. She saw a person of extraordinary quality, a person the world had tried to break and couldn't, a person who had been given nothing and somehow become someone who gives everything. She saw the best human being she had ever met, and she had met senators and CEOs and Nobel laureates, and none of them, not one, came close to this boy with the library books and the half piece of bread. "I need you to finish school," Margaret said. "I need you to walk across that stage and get your diploma. I need you to do that because you earned it and because I want to see it. That is what I need. Okay? And I need you to promise me something else. Anything. When I die, and I am going to die, Josiah, that is a fact, and I won't have either of us pretending otherwise because pretending is a waste of the time I have left. When I die, I need you to read something for me. At the funeral. I'm going to write it down and put it in an envelope. It will say things that some people won't want to hear, but I need them said, and I trust your voice to say them. Will you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Even if it's hard?" "Especially if it's hard." Margaret reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were thin now, thinner than they had been on the courthouse steps, the bones more visible beneath the skin, the veins standing up like tiny blue rivers on a relief map. But her grip was strong. The grip of a woman who had held a company together with these hands, who had designed surgical instruments with these fingers, who had signed billion-dollar contracts and shaken the hands of presidents and held her dying husband's hand in a hospital bed and never once let go before she was ready. "You are the best thing that ever sat down beside me," Margaret said, "and I have sat in boardrooms with senators." The months that followed were hard, the hardest months of Josiah's life, which is saying something, because Josiah's life had been nothing but hard months stacked on top of each other like bricks in a wall. But this was a different kind of hard. The streets were hard because they were empty. No food, no shelter, no love. Margaret's illness was hard because it was full of love that was running out of time. And time, Josiah learned, is the cruelest thief of all. Because at least when the streets stole from him, he could see what was being taken. But time steals the people you love so slowly that you don't notice until you look up one morning and they're different, smaller, quieter, closer to the door. Margaret declined the way a strong person declines, slowly, stubbornly, fighting for every day like it was a contract negotiation she refused to lose. She still insisted on getting dressed every morning. She still sat in her armchair by the window. She still argued with Josiah about books. One afternoon, she spent 45 minutes making the case that Toni Morrison's Beloved was the greatest American novel ever written, and Josiah countered with Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. And they went back and forth until Margaret laughed so hard she started coughing, and Josiah brought her water and rubbed her back and said, "Fine, Morrison wins, but only because you're sick and I'm a gentleman." "I would have won anyway," Margaret said. "I always win." Josiah was there for all of it, every day, every night. He drove her to chemotherapy appointments in the old Volvo. She did 3 rounds before she said enough was enough, gripping the steering wheel with his newly licensed hands, his eyes on the road, his jaws set, trying not to look at the way Margaret pressed her hand to her stomach during every bump and pothole. He cooked dinner every night, the recipes she had taught him, her recipes. The onion soup she made for Thomas on cold evenings. The roast chicken with rosemary that she said was the first thing she ever cooked that didn't taste like punishment. He sat beside her bed and read to her when she was too tired to hold a book. Baldwin, Morrison, Langston Hughes, sometimes the newspaper, sometimes the cereal box because she said his voice made even ingredient lists sound like literature. He graduated from Waverly Prep in June, first in his English class, 7th overall in a class of 48 students. 48 students who had tutors and prep courses and parents who checked their homework and college funds that had been growing since before they were born. Margaret was there. She came in a wheelchair, pushed by a home nurse named Dolores who was strong and gentle and called Margaret Miss M. Margaret wore a navy blue dress, the same color as Josiah's blazer, and when they called his name and he walked across the stage, she stood up from that wheelchair. She stood up. Dolores reached for her arm, but Margaret shook her off. She stood on her own 2 feet and she clapped. And the people around her, who didn't know the story, who didn't know about the courthouse steps or the pigeons or the half piece of bread, looked at this old woman standing and clapping with tears streaming down her face, and they thought, she must be his grandmother. She was something better than that. She was the person who chose him. Now, I need to tell you about the children. Because the children are the part that's going to make you angry. And it should make you angry. Because what these 3 grown adults did, or rather, what they didn't do, while their mother was alive, is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. When Richard, Laura, and David found out that a homeless teenager had been living in their mother's house for 2 years, they didn't call to ask if she was happy. They didn't call to ask if she needed anything. They didn't drive to Baltimore to meet this young man who had brought their mother back to life. No, they lost their minds. And the reason they lost their minds had nothing to do with Margaret's well-being, and everything to do with $1.4 billion. Richard called first. He called Margaret on a Wednesday evening from his home office in Bethesda, his voice tight and controlled, the voice of a man who has practiced being calm when he is furious. Margaret could hear ice clinking in a glass. Richard always drank scotch during difficult conversations, like it was liquid courage in a crystal tumbler. Mother, who is this boy living in your house? His name is Josiah. He is my friend and my companion, and the person who cooks my dinner and reads me books and drives me to the doctor. Which is more than I can say for you, Richard. Mother, don't be dramatic. I'm concerned. He's a teenager. He's from the streets. Do you have any idea how this looks? People are talking. Vanessa heard about it at her book club. Her friends are asking questions. I don't care what Vanessa's book club thinks, Richard. I have never cared what Vanessa thinks about anything. And I am not being dramatic. I am being accurate. You have called me 4 times this year. 4 times. Josiah has cooked me dinner 212 times. I counted. I have nothing else to do in this house but count. Richard pressed harder. He suggested that Josiah was taking advantage of her. He suggested that a homeless teenager living with a wealthy, elderly woman was a red flag. He said the words elder abuse and undue influence and cognitive evaluation in the same sentence, which made Margaret so angry she hung up the phone, actually pressed the red button with her thumb, hard, and didn't answer when he called back 3 times. Laura came next. She drove from Potomac on a Saturday morning, unannounced, wearing a cashmere sweater and driving a white SUV that probably cost more than Josiah's entire life up to that point. She walked into the brownstone like she was conducting a property inspection, looking at the walls, the floors, the furniture, checking to see if anything had been moved or sold or given away. She looked at Josiah, who was sitting at the kitchen table doing his history homework, a textbook open beside a plate of toast, with the expression of someone who has discovered a stain on an expensive sofa that she can't quite identify but knows she doesn't like. "Mother, can we speak privately?" Laura said, loud enough for Josiah to hear every word, which was either careless or deliberate, and with Laura it was hard to tell the difference. They went into the living room. Josiah stayed at the kitchen table. He could hear them through the wall. The brownstone had old walls, and old walls keep secrets about as well as old friends, which is to say, not at all. Laura's voice was high and fast and worried, not worried about Margaret, worried about the estate. "Mother, you need to think about what you're doing. This boy, you don't know anything about him. He could be stealing from you. He could be recording you. He could be manipulating you. Has he asked about your finances? Has he mentioned the will? Have you changed your will?" There it was again, the will. Every conversation with her children eventually arrived at the will, like a river finding the sea. "He has never asked me for a single thing," Margaret said. Her voice was calm, but underneath it was a current of something vast and cold and final. "Not once. In 2 years. He has never asked for money. He has never asked about my estate. He has never opened my mail or looked at my bank statements or suggested I see a different lawyer. The only thing he has ever given me is his company, his time, his attention, and half a piece of bread, which is more than any of you have given me in the last 10 years of my life." The room went silent. Laura left an hour later. She didn't say goodbye to Josiah. She didn't even look at him as she passed through the kitchen. She left the front door open when she walked out, which Josiah closed gently behind her, the way he closed everything, carefully, without slamming, because Josiah had learned that the people who slam doors are the same people who break things. David didn't call or visit. He sent an email. 3 sentences, written on his phone, probably while standing in line at a coffee shop. "Mom, I heard about the boy. I think you should be careful. People take advantage." 3 sentences from the son she had loved most. The son she had built a room for in her heart that was bigger than any other room. The son she had given $1 million to across 3 failed businesses because she believed in him when no one else did. The son who had stopped calling because the shame of owing his mother money was heavier than the love he felt for the woman who gave it to him. 3 sentences. No phone call. No visit. No "how are you feeling?" No "I love you." 3 sentences and a period, which is just another way of saying, "I'm done talking about this." Margaret read the email. She closed her laptop. She looked at Josiah, who was on the couch reading James Baldwin with Bertrand on his feet. "Josiah," she said. "Ma'am? When I die, I want you to read what I've written. Every word. Even the parts about my children. Especially the parts about my children. Will you do that?" "I already promised I would." "I know. I just needed to hear you say it again. Promises sound different when you say them twice. They sound more real." But the biggest secret hadn't come out yet, because what Margaret wrote in that envelope was going to change everything. Not just for her family, but for Josiah and for 300 people sitting in wooden pews on a Sunday morning in October. Margaret died on a Sunday morning in October, 6 days after Josiah's 19th birthday. She died in her own bed, in the brownstone in Roland Park, with the morning light coming through the curtains. White curtains that Josiah had washed the week before because Margaret liked them clean, liked the light that came through them to be pure. And Bertrand was curled at her feet in his usual spot, his fur warm against her ankles, and Josiah was sitting in the wooden chair beside her bed, holding her hand, reading aloud from a book of poems by Langston Hughes, because Margaret had said the night before, in a voice that was barely a whisper but still sharp, still precise, still Margaret, "Read me something that sounds like hope." She went quietly. One breath, and then another, and then a longer space between them, and then one more, and then nothing. Josiah felt her hand go slack in his. He kept reading for another full minute before he stopped. Then he set the book down, still open, still face up, still mid-poem, on the nightstand beside the lamp. He placed Margaret's hand on her chest, over her heart. He pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. He sat there for a long time. He did not call anyone. He did not cry. He just sat in the chair, holding the white envelope she had given him 2 weeks earlier, and listened to the silence of the house. The clock ticking in the hallway, the refrigerator humming downstairs, Bertrand purring at her feet, not knowing yet, not understanding. "Thank you, Margaret," Josiah said very softly. "For the step, for the sandwich, for the books and the room and the cat and everything. Thank you for sitting down." The funeral was held at Mount Vernon Methodist Church, a large stone building with stained glass windows that threw colored light across the wooden pews like paint on a canvas. And 300 people came. Business associates, former employees, board members, politicians, journalists. People who knew Margaret's name from magazine covers and Forbes lists and the names of hospital wings she had funded. They came in dark suits and dark dresses, and they filled the pews and the balcony and the overflow room, and they spoke of Margaret Holloway in the language of achievement. The patents, the revenue, the philanthropy, the awards. Richard sat in the front row with Vanessa. Laura sat beside them with Craig. David sat at the end of the pew, alone, looking at his phone. 3 children at their mother's funeral, and not one of them was crying. The service was long. Eulogies from business partners, a reading from the pastor, a hymn, and then the pastor stepped forward and said, "Mrs. Holloway left specific instructions for this service. She requested that the final reading be delivered by a young man named Josiah Benton." A murmur went through the church. Richard's head snapped toward the pastor. Laura whispered something to Craig. David looked up from his phone for the first time. Josiah stood. He was sitting in the 3rd row, not the front, because the front was for family, and the Holloway children had made it very clear through their lawyer that Josiah was not family. He was wearing a dark suit that Margaret had bought him for graduation, and he was holding a white envelope. He walked to the lectern. He stood there for a moment, looking out at 300 faces. His hands were trembling, his throat was tight. But his eyes, those large, serious, coffee-black eyes, were steady. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Margaret's small, precise script. And he began to read. "My name is Margaret Clarissa Holloway. I am writing this in my own hand, in my own home, in my right mind, with a cat on my lap and a boy in the next room doing his homework. If you are hearing this, I am dead, and I have a few things to say." The church was silent. 300 people holding their breath. Josiah continued. "To my colleagues and employees, thank you. You built something with me that I could not have built alone. I am grateful. To the doctors and nurses who cared for me, thank you. You were kind when kindness was the only medicine left." He paused. He took a breath. He read the next part. "To my children, Richard, Laura, David, I love you. I have always loved you. But love does not make me blind. In the last 10 years of my life, the 3 of you visited me a combined total of 14 times. 14 times in 10 years. I counted. I had nothing to do in that house but count. Richard, you called on Christmas and sometimes on my birthday. Laura, you visited once a year and asked about my will every single time. David, you borrowed $1 million from me across 3 loans, repaid none of it, and stopped speaking to me when the shame became too heavy. Richard's face was red. Laura was staring at the floor. David's hand was covering his mouth. Josiah's voice shook, but he kept reading. I do not say this to shame you publicly, though I understand that is what is happening. I say this because you need to hear it, and you would never have listened if I told you in private. I tried. For years I tried. I called. I wrote letters. I left the front door unlocked. But you were too busy counting what you would inherit to notice that the woman you were inheriting it from was disappearing. The church was so quiet you could hear the candles flickering on the altar. And then a boy sat down beside me on a courthouse step. A homeless boy, 16 years old. He had nothing. Nothing in this world except half a piece of bread and the good sense to share it. He did not know my name. He did not know my net worth. He did not know that the old woman feeding pigeons was worth more money than he would ever see in his lifetime. He sat down because the step was warm and I was there. And he offered me bread because his mother taught him to share. Josiah's voice broke on the word, mother. He paused. He pressed his lips together. He breathed in. He continued. That boy, Josiah Marcus Benton, became my friend. He read to me. He cooked for me. He made me laugh, which is harder than building a company, I assure you. He sat with me through chemotherapy. He held my hand when I was afraid. He never asked for a single thing, not one thing. And he saved half of everything he had, always, because he was taught that someone always needs it more. Margaret's letter continued. Josiah read every word. I have therefore amended my will as follows. To Richard Holloway, I leave the amount he invested in our relationship over the last decade, which, calculated by visits, phone calls, and actual presence, comes to approximately the cost of 14 dinners and 6 bottles of wine. I have rounded up. $50,000. A gasp went through the church. Richard's mouth fell open. To Laura Holloway Price, I leave the answer to the question she asked me every single year. Yes, Laura, I did update my will. $200,000. Laura made a sound, a sharp, strangled sound, like she had swallowed something wrong. To David Holloway, I leave forgiveness for the $1 million he borrowed and never repaid. I also leave him this advice, which is worth more than the money. Stop running from yourself. You were a brilliant boy. You can still be a brilliant man. $100,000. David's head dropped. His shoulders shook. It might have been grief. It might have been shame. It was probably both. The remainder of my estate, the house, the investments, the accounts, the stake in Holloway Medical Systems, totaling approximately $1.4 billion, I leave to Josiah Marcus Benton. The church erupted, not in applause, in chaos. Richard stood up. Laura grabbed Craig's arm. David looked up from his hands with an expression of pure disbelief. 300 people turned to look at the young man standing at the lectern in his dark suit, holding a white envelope, his hands trembling, but his voice, that voice, steady as the courthouse steps where it all began. But Josiah wasn't finished. There was one more paragraph. Josiah, if you are reading this, then you kept your promise. You always keep your promises. That is why I chose you. Not because you are perfect, not because you need the money, but because you will do with it what I should have done with it when I was alive. You will share it. You will break it in half and give the bigger half to someone who needs it more. That is what you do. That is who you are. The boy who shares his bread. Josiah folded the letter. He placed it back in the envelope. He looked at the 300 faces staring at him, some in shock, some in anger, some with tears streaming down their cheeks. He looked at Richard and Laura and David in the front row, their faces a mixture of fury and shame, and something that might, in time, become understanding. And then Josiah said the only thing he could think of, the only thing that felt true. He said it softly, leaning into the microphone so the whole church could hear. She just wanted someone to sit with her. That's all she ever wanted. She wasn't looking for a CEO or a board member or an heir. She was looking for someone to share the step with. And I'm glad it was me. He walked back to his seat. The church was silent for a long time. The pastor wiped his eyes. The organist forgot to play. Bertrand the cat, who Dolores the nurse had brought in a carrier and placed under the pew, meowed once. A short, sharp sound that broke the silence the way only a cat can, with absolute indifference to the gravity of the moment. People laughed. People cried. Some did both. In the months that followed, Richard contested the will. Of course he did. His lawyers filed motions and challenges and claims of undue influence that were so desperate and so hollow that the judge dismissed them with barely concealed contempt. Margaret's own lawyer, a formidable woman named Helen Park who had handled Margaret's legal affairs for 30 years, presented a mountain of documentation. Medical records proving Margaret's mental competence, letters Margaret had written to each of her children that went unanswered, a detailed accounting of every visit, every call, every communication over the last decade. 14 visits in 10 years. The numbers didn't lie. The will stood. Josiah did what Margaret knew he would do. He didn't keep it all. Of course he didn't. He was the boy who saved half his bread. He was the boy whose mother taught him that someone always needs it more. Margaret knew that. She had counted on it. She had, in fact, designed her entire estate plan around the certainty that Josiah Benton would do the right thing. Not because someone told him to, but because doing the right thing was so deeply embedded in him that it was less a choice than a reflex, like breathing, like blinking, like breaking bread in half. He established the Margaret Holloway Foundation in January, funded with $800 million, more than half of the estate. He sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Baltimore, wearing his dark suit and his serious face, and he signed papers that moved $800 million into a foundation whose mission he wrote himself on a yellow legal pad at the kitchen table in the brownstone, with Bertrand asleep on the chair next to him and a cup of coffee growing cold beside the stack of documents. The mission was simple, and he wrote it in plain language because Margaret had taught him that the most important things in the world should be said simply. to provide housing, education, and books for homeless young people across the United States, so that no child sleeps outside when there are rooms with lights on, and no child goes hungry for words when there are libraries full of them.
He hired Ms. Watkins, the librarian from Cathedral Street, the woman with the gray hair and the cat-eye glasses who had saved him books in paper bags without ever asking where he lived, to run the Foundation's literacy program. When Josiah called her and told her what he wanted to do, Ms. Watkins was silent on the phone for a long time. Then she said, "Josiah Benton, I always knew those books were going to come back around." She started the following Monday. He opened 3 community centers in Baltimore in the first year alone. One in East Baltimore, near the group home he had run from. One in West Baltimore, in a neighborhood where the nearest library was 40 minutes by bus. One in Waverly, 2 blocks from the courthouse steps. Each one had a library. Each library had a reading corner with a lamp and comfortable chairs and a shelf marked, "Take one, leave one," that was always full because the community kept filling it. Each center had a kitchen that served free meals, breakfast and dinner, and the meals were simple and warm and good. Rice and beans, soup, sandwiches, bread, always bread. And above the door of each community center was a small bronze plaque, paid for with Josiah's own money, not the Foundation's, because some things are personal. The plaque read, "There's always somebody who needs it more. Denise Benton." His mother's words, on a bronze plaque, above a door that would never be locked. Josiah kept the brownstone. He kept Bertrand, who was getting old now and slept more than he was awake, and had developed a habit of sitting on Josiah's chest at 4 in the morning and staring at him until Josiah woke up and fed him. He kept the old Volvo, even though he could have bought any car in the world, because the Volvo smelled like Margaret's hand lotion, and the leather seats still had the impression of her small body in the driver's seat. And some things you don't replace.
Some things you keep not because they work, but because they remember. He kept cooking Margaret's recipes at the kitchen table. The onion soup, the roast chicken, the terrible salad that Margaret insisted was delicious even though it was just lettuce, tomatoes, and too much vinegar. He cooked for himself, and sometimes for Ms. Watkins, who came by on Sundays, and sometimes for Dolores, the nurse, who still visited even though her patient was gone, because some bonds don't end when the job does. He went to college, not Harvard or Yale or Princeton, though every admissions office in the country would have rolled out the red carpet for a student with his story and his grades and his resources.
He chose the University of Maryland because it was 20 minutes from the courthouse steps and 15 minutes from Margaret's grave at Druid Ridge Cemetery and 5 minutes from the library on Cathedral Street, where Ms. Watkins still saved him books in paper bags, even now, even though he could buy the whole library if he wanted to. Old habits, the good kind. He studied English literature. He sat in lecture halls with 18-year-olds who had never missed a meal and had never slept in a doorway and had never wondered if they would eat tomorrow, and he listened to professors talk about poverty in Dickens novels, and he thought about the gap between reading about hunger and knowing what it feels like when your stomach eats itself. And he raised his hand and said things that made the room go quiet. Not because he was trying to be impressive, because he had lived what they were studying. And lived experience has a weight that textbooks can never match.
And every Tuesday and Thursday, rain or shine, Josiah Benton walked to the Waverly Courthouse steps with a brown paper bag of breadcrumbs and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Roast beef with mustard and lettuce on rye, always. Margaret's sandwich, the one she brought him for 2 years. He sat on the warm gray granite. He fed the pigeons. They came to him now without hesitation, landing on his shoes, pecking at his fingers, cooing like old friends greeting each other. And he saved half his sandwich. Always. Every time. No matter what. He wrapped the other half in the wax paper and set it on the step beside him, Margaret's side, and he left it there when he stood up to go. Somebody always took it. A man sleeping on the bench, a woman walking home from a night shift, a kid cutting through the courtyard. Somebody always needed it more. Because there is always somebody who needs it more. And that, right there, is the whole point of this story. It's not about $1 billion. It's not about a will or a funeral or ungrateful children or a cat named Bertrand. It's about a boy who had nothing and gave half of it away, and an old woman who had everything and couldn't give it to the people she loved because they didn't want her. They wanted the money. The money is the easy part. The money is just numbers on a page. The hard part, the real part, the part that matters, is the sitting, the showing up, the bread. Margaret Holloway spent 83 years on this earth. She built a company. She made a fortune. She changed an industry. But the thing she was proudest of, the thing she wrote about in that letter, the thing she wanted 300 people to hear, was that a homeless boy sat down beside her and shared his bread. That was her legacy. Not the patents, not the profits, not the buildings with her name on them. The bread, the step, the boy. And the boy remembered. The boy always remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next story.